Alright, this is Unit 4, Video 2 of U.S. History, and this video is called the Second Great Awakening. We've already seen one Great Awakening in the 1730s and 40s, all the way back in probably Unit 1, and so this is going to be the second one, and they're both mentioned specifically on the standards, so we've got to know them and know the difference. In the 1820s, we have the Second Great Awakening that sweeps across the country. Preachers gave sermons that appealed to all classes, and it spread this message of salvation for everyone. The movement also gave rise to reformers who wanted to right these social ills or the social problems of the era that they saw. And that's really the focus that we'll have, is how these reform movements were influenced by the Great Awakening and what those reform movements were trying to accomplish. And three of the areas that we'll look at are temperance, public education, and women's efforts to gain suffrage, or the right to vote. Your first question asks how the Second Great Awakening impact other reform movements. It was spreading this message of salvation, of Christianity, and so people heard that and they responded by saying, well, how can we spread kind of these ideals of Christianity? And so the Second Great Awakening was really the spark for these other reform movements that we'll look at. The first one is temperance. As industrialization and urbanization increased, so too did alcohol consumption, especially during the early 1800s. Now, the temperance movement stressed the increases in domestic violence that were taking place, as well as a waste of income as reasons to drink less. So the temperance movement pushed drinking less or maybe abstaining completely from alcohol, and those two big reasons were domestic violence and as a waste of income, spending on alcohol. The movement soon turned to encourage people to just stop drinking completely, and it was successful in reducing the amount of alcohol consumed in the United States. The problem didn't disappear, but it was successful in some of its goals. Here on the left, you see what's typical of a kind of a camp meeting during that time. So you'd have the preacher giving the sermon from here on this stage, and I don't know if you can see it, but in the background there are these triangles. They're basically big camp meetings, and so this is where the people would stay for 3-4 days, a week maybe, even in some cases. And so there are still some of those around in North Georgia. If you've ever heard of camp meeting, I know there's one in Dawsonville. And so that's kind of the idea here. In the picture on the right, you have these women who have just gone into a bar. These women have hatchets. They're busting up these barrels of alcohol. And so this was kind of one of the extreme sides of temperance movement, but women getting involved in that for sure. Another one that we see is public education being reformed. Before the 1840s, there was little public education in the country, and really just the wealthy could afford to hire a tutor for their children. Horace Mann, however, helped promote this cause of public education. He wanted to create good citizens, unite society, and prevent crime and poverty, and he thought that public education was the way to do that. The financial plan for free education that Mann advocated is pretty much the model that American schools use today, with property taxes funding the vast majority of public education in the country. We also see the women's suffrage movement. Throughout the 1800s and the 19th century, women were legally and socially inferior to men. They could not vote. They could not own their own property if they were married, and so women began to see how it just didn't mesh with the Second Great Awakening. These ideals of equality. Women have been active in the temperance movement, and so they used that experience to fight for women's equality. They were led by a prominent woman named Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others, but in 1848, Stanton and some women organized a conference in Seneca Falls, New York, to discuss the issues of women's rights, and women's suffrage was one of those things that they discussed. And so this kind of marked the beginning of the women's rights movement that we'll see during this time. On the left, you have a picture of Horace Mann, the guy for public education, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton on the right here. So your goals, the goal for the temperance movement was to get people to drink less or not drink at all alcohol. Public education was to get more free public education to students, to kids in the country, to provide them with an education. That was the goal. And then third, obviously, the goal of the women's suffrage movement was to gain women's suffrage, to gain women's right to vote. And so we've got to make sure we know what each of those movements were, but also what they were trying to accomplish. Finally, we'll talk about slavery. Since it had been banned in the Northwest Territories, many in the country thought it would just soon die out around the country, just naturally. And if not for the cotton gin in 1793, that might have been the case. Slavery was actually slowly decreasing in the United States before the cotton gin was patented. And so slavery very well may have just went away, died a natural death. But the cotton gin definitely changed that. The cotton gin quickly removed seeds from the cotton fibers. Do not think that the cotton gin actually picked cotton. Because if you think that it picked cotton, then you would think, well, you don't need as many slaves because you can use this machine. But the opposite is true. Because it removed the seeds, what they actually needed was more cotton coming in from the fields, and so that was put on the slaves, so they needed even more slaves to bring in more cotton. So you get this increased need for slaves because it could be, as it was called, cleaned when you remove the seeds. It would clean the cotton much faster. So the cotton gin drastically increases the number of slaves in the United States. And with the increase in slavery, we get a stronger call for abolition, so the ending of slavery. This is Eli Whitney on the left, and on the right, the far right, you have a kind of a crude picture of one of the early cotton gins where it would separate the seeds. And here in the middle, you can see this chart of what happened to slavery. So it was increasing, and then right before the Revolution, it started this kind of pretty sharp decline, and then right here is where we see the cotton gin, and you just see it, spike incredibly right there. So that's what we have there. Slave rebellions and this call for abolition in response to this increase in slavery, efforts to end slavery really got a lot stronger during this time. One group wanted to free all the slaves and send them to Africa, right? Another group called for immediate freedom. So there were a lot of groups calling to free the slaves, but not any real idea of what to actually do after that. And so men and women played important roles in this movement, and for the first time, blacks are actually playing a major role as well. Frederick Douglass being one of those for sure. And so abolition became a divisive issue in the country, as slavery was as well. So slave rebellions continued during this time. Slave goals were always to gain freedoms or even their independence. They thought if we rebel, we will show them how terrible this system is, and we'll gain maybe some freedoms, not our whole freedom, but maybe we'll get some sort of rights. But the reaction from Southerners was always the exact opposite. They always strengthened the slave laws and codes as a result because they became more fearful that these rebellions would lead to a larger rebellion and that they would be killed in it. And so the result of these slave rebellions was always a tighter slave codes and laws. And so your final question is, what impact did the slave rebellions have on abolition? It was mixed. In the South, it had the opposite effect. Abolition was, thought to be even more crazy in the South after slave rebellions. Well, they would say, look what, if these slaves, look what they'll do if they have independence. However, in the North, the call was greater for abolition with these slave rebellions. It was, look what these slaves are going through, and we need immediate abolition. So, depending on what part of the country you're in, depending on the impact, but overall, slave rebellions led to a greater call for abolition, with this, most Southerners being the exception. And then abolitionism was a call to end slavery, so to give slaves their freedom and their independence.